Hello, check-in time. So you may notice that my voice is kind of different. um, yeah, I just had like a few days of sore throat and now my throat is okay, but now I have something up with my nose or something. So my voice is kind of different this time. Anyway, I'm really excited about this check-in because I am going to talk about one book that I gave 5 stars to. So yeah, 5-star reads. It's really interesting. I have 3 books that are fairly different from one another, and but what's interesting is that, and this is just something very trivial, 2 of these books actually reference that Oh Susanna song, which is kind of interesting because those 2 books are very different from one another, and one of those books is Memory in Oblivion by Wang Zhousheng, and this book was originally written in Chinese and was translated into English by Blishen. So this is a really interesting book because I am always interested in books that deals with memory and the fickleness of memory, especially the unreliability of memory, and that's certainly what this book tackles. So this is a novel about a fractured marriage. So basically we have a couple who lives in China, in modern day China. Not exactly a couple, they are divorced, so elderly people. The main character's name is Ling Deqing. She's an old woman living by herself, and then one day she receives a visit from her husband, whom she has divorced like 20 years prior to that, and his name is Xiao Zichen. And what's interesting is that Xiao Zichen actually has remarried, but then her second wife has died. So it's really perplexing to Ling Deqing that her former husband suddenly comes over and visits her, and it turns out that Xiao Zichen has been suffering from an onset of Alzheimer's, and therefore he has been having issues with his memory, and he didn't even remember that he is divorced from Ling Deqing. And so all of these things just sort of bring up past demons, past ghosts, or whatever. And both of these characters would have to navigate sort of their new life that is kind of liminal, so to speak, because they're married but also at the same time not married. They had issues in their marriage before, but because of the memory issues that the husband has, somehow the problems that they had just didn't seem like that significant anymore. But at the same time, things are all just very complicated, and when their daughter finds out, everything just becomes sort of complicated also. So this is, in short, a domestic fiction. I always find domestic fiction to be kind of fun, I would say, because I really like stories about families. But I think this book has another layer of context that makes it even more interesting, especially when it comes to complicated family relationship that is made even further complicated by things like illness and any other kinds of hardships, basically. I think the way that the plot of this book unfolds really elegantly. There are certain moments that sort of veer towards being sweet, but not in a very melodramatic way, I would say. Once in a while, this book would also go towards the theme of collective memory of a country, which sometimes I do find kind of heavy-handed. Most of the focus is still on the unreliability of memory in a family context, but sometimes the book will go into these topics. But overall, I think it's a nice story. However, I do think that the edition that I have here has some pretty the translation is the translation probably needs more editing, I would say, because I found a lot of missing words. It's not a lot actually, but it's noticeable, and I think once it gets to the point where it is noticeable, then certainly the editing could certainly be improved. The translation itself is also kind of strange, because most of the time the words that are used in here are sort of normal, casual, everyday words, but sometimes suddenly you'll see some bombastic word being used in a sea of really normal, everyday words. Like, instead of saying that someone is the center of everyone's attention, you see things like cynosure of all eyes, which is really strange. It's really jarring. But overall, I think the translation is kind of strange a bit, in a way that it just doesn't seem to pay attention, a lot of attention to style, like to linguistic style, you know, or stylistic language, but rather it just focuses on translating the story using the most normal, ordinary English as possible, which I think takes a little bit of that elegance away from this story. So I think that's a bit of a shame. But overall, I think it's kind of a nice story, but maybe the writing itself is not like really stellar. The next one is also a translated fiction. I don't have much to say about the translation itself for this story. This one is On the Banks of Mayyazhi by Mukundan. This one was translated from Malayalam by Gita, Krishnankutty. So I also read this one in honor of a readathon that is going on in April. I think it's Lit with Indian Lit. And basically with that readathon, what you do is that you read novels or books, Indian books, translated Indian books basically. So this one was translated from Malayalam. So this is a historical fiction. This book is set in this town called Mayyazhi, or I think it's called Mahe also. And it is set around the time when the town was still under the rule of French colonialists. And so you see a lot of French colonialism going on in this book. And basically what happens here is that it sort of chronicles the time when the town is still colonized by the French, and the effort that some of the local townsfolk, in order to be liberated from the French colonialists. And but the thing is, the story is not that straightforward, because even though this story sort of chronicles that journey towards independence, it also shows the different kinds of perspective that the people in this town have towards their French rulers. Like, some people are starting to feel uneasy about the fact that they are ruled by a foreign power. They have been influenced by the teaching of communism and socialism, and they feel that they need to get their land back for themselves, while some others, especially the ones who have been who are a bit older in the town, they feel comfortable with the French rule, and they would rather that the French people don't leave the town and just remain there as their ruler, because they are very much kind of enamored by the romantic past that the French rule has sort of dominating their lives. And so not only you have the conflict between people who want independence and the French rulers, you also have the conflict between people who do want independence and people who don't want the independence. The main character in this book, I would say, is a young man named Dasan, and he is kind of like the person who is kind of like, in a way, in this book, spearheading the movement, the freedom movement in this town, and basically his actions sort of bring him at odds with his family, who would rather want him to just focus on improving his life, getting himself a comfortable life for himself and his family instead of being a freedom fighter. But he is very much colored by idealism, and he wants to set this town free. But one thing I would say about this book is that it's not about this main character, even though we see him a lot. It is also about other characters in this book. And even though it's a fairly thin book, it's 200 plus pages long, we see tons and tons and tons of characters in here. Many of those characters are people who are just sort of mentioned in passing. We don't see a lot of dimensions for these characters. So I would say this book is mostly a book about the town itself, about how the town sort of undergoes change, but at the same time, in some respects, the town remains the same as well. How the town sort of has this magical element associated with it, and as you can see here, there's a dragonfly on the cover. So dragonfly is going to be a very important motif also in this book, and I would say that this dragonfly sort of represents the magical element that is associated with the town of Mayyazhi, and how, regardless of who rules the town, this dragonfly just pretty much is a recurrent thing in this town, in this book, from beginning to end. And so I would say this is a book that is focused mostly on the town itself, and the characters are just sort of kind of like moving chess pieces that sort of shows you, how this town are kind of like split into different factions and stuff. So quite an interesting book. If you really like historical fiction, and honestly, I have never really read anything about French colonialism activity in India before, so that is kind of interesting also. So I definitely learned something new from this novel as well. So the next one is a 5-star read. I really enjoyed this one, although I took a long time to finish this book. It is V.C. Andrews' Flowers in the Attic, and I think a lot of readers, a lot of viewers would probably know this novel. I think this novel has some kind of reputation for being, I don't know, scandalous or shocking or whatever. And my reading experience of this novel certainly is a very unique one. When I first started reading this book, I had this overall sense of dread looming all over, because I sort of knew that this novel has some really messed up things going on in it, but even I have not really reached those parts. I was in like the initial 3 chapters or so, and if you have read this novel, the first few chapters are sort of the happy chapters, so to speak. And I already had a sense of dread. So for those of you who don't know what this book is about, Flowers in the Attic is about how 4 kids are being locked up in the attic for many years by their mother and their grandmother, because their mother wants to wait for the grandfather to pass away so that the mother can get enough wealth. And when the mother can get enough wealth, then she will set the children free from the attic, because basically the mother is just hiding the children in the attic because the mother doesn't want the grandfather to know that the children are in the attic. So the entire novel is pretty much just about how these children survive in the attic, being locked up for so many years, and just hearing this description, I would say like this book feels kind of crazy and absurd. Like locking someone up in the attic is just like next level gothic stuff that you don't really expect people in real life would do. I mean, I hope people don't do that in real life, but it's really dreadful once you get to the point of the story where the children are in fact in the attic. It feels really dreadful to read this book. I was really stressed reading this, even though it was written in this like really simple language. The novel is narrated by one of the children, the daughter named Kathy. So we see the story from this character's first person point of view. But yeah, back to like how I felt about this book. I was really stressed out reading this. There are a lot of chapters in which we see how difficult it is for these children to live in the attic, and how they have to deal with the abuse that the grandmother subjects them to, the horrible treatments that this really religious grandmother, and there's a reason why this grandmother treats these children really horribly. It's a bad reason, but there is a reason why. It's a spoilery reason, so I won't get into that. But basically, this grandmother is just a horrible person who treats these children really horribly. But after those moments in the book, you'll get moments in which the children, Kathy just sort of describes their life in the attic in this kind of like happy way, which sort of feels like she's dissociating herself from the difficulties that she and her siblings are facing. So you'll get like a few chapters of them having their own life, making their own life happy and adventurous in the attic, and then after that you'll get some horrible episodes again with the grandma or whoever, and then after that you'll get some happy episodes again, and it just makes it, this whiplash just kind of produces that effect that is kind of unsettling for me. There is a little bit of uncanny valley thing going on, and not to mention the fact that all these children are described as blonde, blue-eyed, and that imagery, I think there is. I wonder if there is a reason for that, that stylistic choice, because it kind of reminds you of how this entire book just feels really unsettling. I would say this entire book is a coming-of-age story, and it has a bit of that fairy tale element to it as well, how these children are being stuck in an attic somewhere high up, and it reminds me of Rapunzel, seriously. And I don't know about you guys who have read this book, but there's also a mention of rosebush at the bottom. And I'm pretty sure there is a rosebush in the Rapunzel fairy tale as well, and that rosebush is going to it plays an important role in that fairy tale, basically. But yeah, there is a rose bush in Flowers in the Attic as well, and there is kind of a bit of a lampshading by Kathy, the narrator, in regards to this rose bush as well, which I think is kind of interesting. It really ties that whole this book with that fairy tale vibes going on. It's I kind of like it. So I think that this book produces this really interesting vibe that I just haven't seen in other books so far. Yes, a lot of the things in this book are really horrible, that people wouldn't feel comfortable reading, and but I would say that the worst thing that this book shows you is basically the abuse. I think that is the most nauseating thing that I can say happens in this book. A lot of people would say, you know, stuff like you know, sexual relations, incest and stuff, but I think the worst thing in this book is just the abuse. It's just too much. So some people might not feel comfortable with this book, but I would say I liked how this book made me feel. It's a very well written book, I would say. Has a lot of elements that really work together. Yeah, and again, I really like how it sort of blends together, you know, fairy tale elements, uncanny valley, a little bit of that soap opera melodrama as well. A lot of the things that I just find really interesting, and it just mixes all those things together. It's a really good book. So I give this one 5 out of 5 stars. Anyway, those are all the books that I want to talk about in this video, and if you have read any of these books, let me know in the comments below what you think about them, or if you are interested in reading these books, or if you have anything else you want to say, you know, just anything, whatever. But other than that, I'm gonna see you in a different video. So until then, take care. Thanks for watching, and bye.